I was 32 years old the day the world literally started to fade around me. It did not happen all at once, like a light switch flipping off. It was more like someone slowly breathing on a cold window pane, a gray, creeping fog that just would not clear no matter how many times I blinked or rubbed my eyes. I am an art director. My entire life, my career, my identity, it all relies on being able to see color, contrast, and sharp lines. So, when I found myself sitting in a sterile, overly bright ophthalmologist's office that Tuesday afternoon, listening to the doctor drop words like rapid corneal degeneration and permanent vision loss, I felt the air physically leave my lungs. The doctor was kind but brutally firm. My corneas were deteriorating at an aggressive rate. If I did not have a specialized transplant and reconstruction surgery within the next month, the damage would cross the point of no return. I would go blind. There was no alternative, no pill I could take to make it magically stop. The surgery was scheduled for the third week of the following month, and the recovery meant 2 full weeks of absolute darkness. 2 weeks with heavy bandages over my eyes, unable to read, unable to drive, unable to even look at my phone. It was terrifying, but it was my only lifeline. I left the clinic with a folder full of pre-op instructions and a heart heavy with dread. I needed my family. You know that instinct, right? When the ground falls out from under you, you want the people who raised you to tell you it is going to be okay. So, that Sunday, I drove to my parents' house for our usual family dinner. Let me paint a picture of my family dynamic for you. My parents, Victor and Diane, have a very specific, unspoken hierarchy. At the absolute top is my older sister, Stella. Stella is 36, chronically unemployed, and the undisputed golden child. She has 2 kids, Toby, who is 7, and Mia, who is 4. They are good kids, really, but they are loud, chaotic, and completely undisciplined because Stella believes parenting means existing in the same room as them while scrolling on her phone. And then, at the bottom of this hierarchy is me. Harper. The reliable one. The one with the good job, the empty apartment, and the apparently bottomless well of patience and funds. When I walked through the front door, the house was a madhouse. Toby was screaming, running laps around the kitchen island, while Mia was having a meltdown on the rug because her juice was in the blue cup instead of the red one. Stella was lounging on the sofa, filing her nails, completely unbothered. My mother, Diane, was frantically stirring something on the stove, and my father, Victor, was watching a golf game, shouting over the noise. Nobody asked how my week was. Nobody noticed the new, thicker prescription glasses I had to wear just to navigate the driveway. I quietly put my purse down, walked into the kitchen, and started setting the table. I told myself I would wait until dinner was served, until everyone was sitting down, to break the news about my eyes. I needed them to focus. I needed them to hear me. I had this naive hope that maybe, just this once, the chaos would pause and they would actually look at me and see that I was scared. I was so incredibly scared. But, as I would soon learn, my family had a very different agenda for that evening. Dinner was finally on the table. The kids were temporarily distracted by macaroni and cheese, and I took a deep breath, preparing to speak. But before I could even open my mouth, my mother clapped her hands together, her face glowing with a level of excitement I usually only saw when someone complimented her garden. "All right, everyone, listen up," Diane announced, her voice cutting through the clatter of silverware. "Your father and I, along with Stella, have some incredibly exciting news." I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. Stella smirked, leaning back in her chair like a queen holding court. "We're going on a 2-week Caribbean cruise," Victor boomed, raising his water glass. 14 days of sunshine, unlimited buffets, and absolute peace and quiet. We booked the VIP suite package. We leave in exactly 3 weeks. "That is, wow," I said, genuinely taken aback. "That sounds expensive." "Oh, it is a once-in-a-lifetime trip," Diane waved her hand dismissively. "Stella has been so stressed lately with her job hunt. She desperately needs a reset. And your father and I need a break." Which brings us to the logistics. My mother turned to look directly at me. Her smile did not reach her eyes. It was the look she gave when she was about to assign me a chore I could not refuse. Since the cruise is adults only, and frankly, we want to actually relax, you are going to pack a bag and move back into your old room here for the 2 weeks, she said. It was not a question. It was a directive. You will be watching Toby and Mia. You work from home anyway, so it is perfect. You can drop them at school, pick them up, and hold down the fort. I froze. The room suddenly felt very small. I looked at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. The dates of their luxury vacation aligned perfectly, day for day, with my surgery and recovery period. I cannot do that, I said. My voice was quiet, but it sounded like a gunshot in the dining room. Stella stopped chewing. My father lowered his glass. The silence was thick, heavy, and immediately hostile. What do you mean, you cannot? Victor asked, his tone dropping into that dangerous, rumbling register he used when someone dared to defy him. I cannot watch the kids, Dad. I cannot even take care of myself during those 2 weeks, I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was trying to tell you earlier. I went to the eye specialist on Tuesday. My corneas are failing. I am losing my vision. If I do not have a transplant and reconstructive surgery in 3 weeks, I am going to go blind. I will be completely bandaged and bedridden for 14 days. I literally will not have eyes to watch the kids with. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the horror, the sympathy, the sudden realization that their youngest daughter was facing a life-altering disability. Instead, Stella rolled her eyes. Oh my God, Harper, really? Stella groaned, tossing her napkin on the table. You always have to do this. You always have to invent some crisis to make everything about you. Invent a crisis? I choked out, staring at her through the gray fog of my failing vision. Stella, I am going blind. This is a surgical operation. It is an eye surgery, Harper, not a heart transplant, Diane snapped, her face flushing with anger. People get LASIK all the time and go to work the next day. You are just being dramatic because you do not want to help your sister. You know she needs this break. It is not LASIK. I raised my voice, the fear finally giving way to desperation. It is a transplant. I cannot delay it, and I absolutely cannot babysit 2 toddlers while I am recovering in complete darkness. Victor slammed his fist on the table, making the plates rattle. Enough. We have paid the non-refundable deposits. We are going. You are going to call your little doctor, tell him you are stressed out, and reschedule the damn appointment. You are going to be here for these kids because that is what family does. You step up. I looked at the 3 of them. My father, red-faced and furious. My mother, glaring at me like I was a traitor. My sister, looking bored and inconvenienced by my potential blindness. They did not care. They genuinely, fundamentally did not care if I lost my sight, as long as it did not interfere with their time by the pool. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the wood floor. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just looked at them and said the only word I had left. No. Then I grabbed my purse, walked out the front door, and drove away, leaving my mother's screaming voice fading behind me. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had been hit by a truck. My phone was blown up with notifications. I had been removed from the family group chat. Stella had posted a long, passive-aggressive status on Facebook about how some people are so selfish they would rather see their own flesh and blood suffer than lift a single finger to help. The comments were full of her friends offering fake sympathy. It made me sick to my stomach. I needed to get away. I could not sit in my apartment and stare at the walls. I packed a small overnight bag and decided to drive up to the lake cabin. Let me explain the cabin. It is a small, 2-bedroom wooden house up in the mountains, about a 2-hour drive from the city. The deed is technically in my parents' names. They bought it cheap 30 years ago. But for the last decade, it had been rotting away. Last year, my dad complained that they would have to sell it because it was unlivable. I could not bear the thought of losing the place where I spent my childhood summers. So, I stepped in. I drained $20,000 from my own personal savings. I paid for a new roof, new plumbing, entirely new hardwood floors, and I spent 6 weekends up there on my hands and knees painting the walls and fixing the deck. I revived that house with my own blood, sweat, and bank account. It was my sanctuary. The drive up the mountain was quiet. The air was crisp, and for a moment, the gray blur in my eyes did not bother me as much when I was looking at the endless green of the pine trees. I just wanted to light a fire, wrap myself in a blanket, and cry in peace. I pulled into the gravel driveway, grabbed my bag, and walked up the steps to the front porch. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the familiar brass key on my keychain, and slid it into the deadbolt. It did not turn. I frowned, jiggling the handle. I pulled the key out, wiped it on my jeans, and tried again. It slid in halfway and stopped. The mechanism was completely different. The old, scratched brass plate had been replaced with a brand new, shiny silver lock. I stood there in the freezing wind, staring at the door. My brain struggled to process what I was looking at. I walked around to the back of the house to check the patio door. Padlocked. A new, heavy-duty padlock that had not been there last month. They changed the locks. My chest tightened, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and hit speed dial for my father. It rang 3 times before he answered. "What?" Victor barked. "No hello. No checking to see if I was okay." "I am at the cabin," I said, my voice trembling. "My key does not work. The lock is different." "That is right," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of warmth. "I had a locksmith go up there first thing this morning." "Why?" "Dad, all my winter clothes are in there. I just drove 2 hours." "Why would you change the locks?" "Because this family shares its resources with people who actually act like family," he stated, hitting every word like a hammer. "If you are going to be selfish, if you are going to ruin your sister's vacation over some minor medical procedure and refuse to help us out, then you do not get to enjoy the perks of this family. We need our space from your toxic attitude. You are not welcome at the cabin until you apologize and agree to watch Toby and Mia. Have a safe drive back." He hung up. I stood on the porch of the house I had spent $20,000 rebuilding. The wind howled through the trees, biting through my thin jacket. I did not bang on the door. I did not scream into the woods. The shock was too absolute. They were holding my sanctuary hostage to force me to cancel a surgery that would save my sight. I turned around, walked back to my car, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time. The gray fog in my vision seemed thicker now. But ironically, as I sat there looking at the locked door, something else became crystal clear. I was not a daughter to them. I was a tool. And when a tool stops being useful, you lock it in the shed. I put the car in reverse and drove down the mountain. I did not cry on the tower drive back to the city. I think my brain had engaged some sort of survival protocol, shutting down the emotional centers so I could focus on keeping the car on the road despite my blurred vision. When I finally walked into my apartment, the silence was deafening. It was not the peaceful silence of a sanctuary. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty room after a funeral. I threw my keys on the counter, walked straight into my home office, and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop. The blue light stung my eyes, forcing me to squint, but I did not care. I needed data. I needed hard, undeniable proof of what my life had actually been for the past decade, because clearly, my memory of being a devoted daughter was not matching their reality of me being a selfish burden. I opened my external hard drive and clicked on a folder labeled Finances. Let me tell you how my family operated and how I became the designated safety net. It started small. When I was 24, just landing my first decent-paying job as a junior designer, Stella decided she wanted to be a life coach. She needed a certification program that cost $3,000. My parents told me it was my duty as a sister to invest in her future, especially since I was single and had disposable income. I paid it. Stella never finished the course. 2 years later, it was a car. Stella's transmission blew, and she needed a vehicle to take Toby to preschool. My dad called me, his voice heavy with stress, saying he could not sleep knowing his grandson was riding the public bus. I took out a loan in my name, a reliable sedan, and Stella promised to make the monthly payments. She made exactly 2 payments before she had to prioritize groceries. I quietly absorbed the car loan for the next 4 years so my credit would not be destroyed. I opened a master Excel spreadsheet and started typing. I am a meticulous record keeper. It is an occupational habit. I had receipts, bank statements, and email confirmations for every major transaction. I just had never put them all on one single page before. I logged the car. I logged the $3,000 for the life coach scam. I logged the time my parents' furnace broke in the dead of winter, and I paid $4,500 for an emergency replacement because Victor's pension was stretched too thin that month. Then came the recurring expenses. 3 years ago, Victor and Diane sat me down and gave me a long speech about how inflation was eating away at their retirement. They looked so small and worried. I agreed to set up an automatic transfer. $500 every single month, deposited directly into their checking account to help with groceries and utilities. I had not missed a single month in 36 months. And then there was Toby and Mia. When Toby turned 5, Stella insisted public school would ruin his creative spirit. She found a private Montessori program. The tuition was staggering. My parents wept, literally wept, saying Toby deserved the best start in life. So, what did the good, reliable aunt do? I started paying the school fees directly to the academy. Every semester. Line by line, row by row, I documented my love. I documented my loyalty. I documented every time I skipped a vacation, every time I bought clothes on clearance, every time I worked overtime just so I could keep the peace and buy my family's happiness. The spreadsheet grew longer, the numbers stacking up in the right-hand column, a digital monument to my own foolishness. My eyes were burning, watering profusely as I stared at the screen. But I could not stop. I was possessed by the need to see the bottom line. I highlighted the final column, dragged the cursor down to the very last entry, the $20,000 for the lake cabin renovation, and clicked the AutoSum button. The number flashed on the screen. It was so large, so absurd, that for a second, my foggy eyes refused to process it. I blinked hard, wiping away the moisture, and leaned closer to the monitor until my nose almost touched the glass. $84,000. I sat back in my chair, the breath rushing out of me in a ragged exhale. $84,000. In less than 10 years. I had poured the equivalent of a down payment on a beautiful house or a fully funded retirement account directly into the pockets of people who had just changed the locks on me because I refused to sacrifice my eyesight for their tropical vacation. I sat alone in my dark office, the glow of the monitor washing over my face, and experienced a complete psychological breakdown. It was not a loud, sobbing breakdown. It was a quiet, earth-shattering realization of my own pathetic reality. I analyzed it, stripping away the emotional defensive walls I had built over a lifetime. Why did I do it? Why did I hand over my hard-earned money time and time again? It was the classic dynamic of the golden child and the scapegoat. Stella was born to be loved. I was born to be useful. I realized with sickening clarity that I had been suffering from a terminal case of trying to buy my parents' affection. I subconsciously believed that if I was generous enough, if I solved enough problems, if I never said no, they would eventually look at me the way they looked at Stella. They would see me. They would value me. But looking at that number, $84,000, I finally understood the transactional nature of my existence in that family. It was never about love. It was a subscription fee. As long as the money flowed, as long as I absorbed the stress and the financial hits, I was allowed a seat at the table. The moment my usefulness stopped, the moment I had the audacity to have a medical crisis that required them to inconvenience themselves, my subscription was canceled. The locks were changed. The grief of losing a family you thought you had is profound. But the grief of realizing you never really had them at all is paralyzing. I felt stupid. I felt hollowed out. I had traded my youth, my security, and almost my dignity for a facade. I looked at my hands resting on the keyboard. They were shaking. Not from sadness anymore, but from a new, strange sensation blooming in my chest. A heat. A tight, focused anger. I reached for my phone. I could not handle this alone, but I definitely could not call my parents. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of the only person in my bloodline who had ever seen through my mother's manipulations. My mother's younger sister. Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was the black sheep of her generation. She was fiercely independent, brutally honest, and had limited her contact with Diane decades ago, though she always made a point to check in on me. I tapped her name and put the phone to my ear. She picked up on the second ring. "Harper? Honey, it is late. Is everything all right?" Hearing a voice that actually held genuine concern for me broke the dam. A single tear escaped, hot and stinging. "Aunt B, I think I just lost my family. Do not move. I am making tea, and you are going to tell me every single detail," Aunt Beatrice ordered. Her tone was sharp, commanding, and exactly what I needed to anchor me. I sat on the floor of my office and talked for an hour. I told her about the failing corneas, the gray fog that was slowly eating my vision. I told her about the dinner, the cruise announcement, and Victor's demand that I act as a free nanny while blindfolded. I told her about driving up to the cabin, the new lock, the phone call. And finally, I told her about the spreadsheet and the $84,000. Aunt Beatrice listened in absolute silence. The only sound on the line was the occasional clink of her teacup against a saucer. When I finally finished, out of breath and exhausted, I waited for her pity. Instead, I got the chilling, tactical mind of a woman who knew her sister's dark side better than anyone. $84,000, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with ice. "Harper, you are not a daughter to them. You are an insurance policy." "I know," I whispered, pulling my knees to my chest. "I feel so stupid, B. I wanted them to be proud of me." "Stop it," she snapped, not unkindly, but firmly. "You have a good heart, and Diane weaponized it. That is on her, not you. But right now, you need to stop crying and start thinking. Because if they are ruthless enough to lock you out of a cabin you paid to fix, just to punish you for being sick, they are not done." "What do you mean?" I asked, wiping my nose with the back of my sleeve. "What else can they do? They already cut me off. They told me not to come back." "They cut off your access to them," Beatrice corrected. "But did you cut off their access to you?" I frowned, confused. "I haven't talked to them since yesterday." "Harper, listen to me carefully." Beatrice's voice dropped an octave, adopting a tone of extreme urgency. 2 years ago, when your father had that minor heart scare, Diane made a massive fuss about medical bills. You told me you opened a joint credit card with your mother. A high-limit card, meant strictly for medical emergencies, and you gave her a physical copy so she wouldn't panic. Do you remember? A jolt of pure electricity shot down my spine. The room seemed to spin. Yes, the medical emergency card. It was a premium travel rewards card I had opened because it had a massive $30,000 limit. I had handed the physical card to my mother in a hospital cafeteria, telling her to keep it in her safe and only use it if it was a matter of life or death, to spare them the stress of loans. I had completely forgotten about it. She had never used it. Not once in 2 years. "Yes," I breathed, my heart rate accelerating to a frantic gallop. I gave her the card. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't do that. "It is for emergencies." "Harper," Beatrice said, her voice echoing with pity and dread. "They just booked a luxury Caribbean cruise. A VIP suite package. Stella has no money. Victor's pension does not cover VIP suites on a whim. And they just declared war on you." "Oh my God," I choked out, scrambling up from the floor. "Do not guess. Do not assume," Beatrice commanded. "Put me on speakerphone. Open your banking portal. Check that card right now." My hands were shaking so violently I dropped my phone twice. I lunged back into my desk chair, my fingers fumbling over the keyboard. I brought up my banking website. The gray fog in my eyes made the letters bleed together, and I had to squint painfully, typing my password wrong on the first try. "I am logging in," I stammered, my chest tight with panic. "Breathe, Harper." "Just look," Beatrice said through the speaker. The little loading circles spun on the screen. It felt like an eternity. A spinning wheel deciding my fate. Then, the dashboard loaded. I scrolled past my checking account, past my savings, down to the credit card section. I stopped breathing. The text on the screen was usually a calm, neutral black. "Tonight, The numbers under the emergency credit card were glowing in angry, glaring red. Available balance, $0 status, maxed out. I rubbed my eyes, pressing the heels of my palms into my sockets so hard it hurt, praying that my failing corneas were just playing a cruel trick on me. I opened my eyes and leaned inches from the monitor. The red text was still there. Harper. Aunt Beatrice's voice filtered through the phone, tight with anticipation. What do you see? I clicked on the account details, my index finger trembling on the mouse. The transaction history populated the screen. There, sitting at the very top, marked as processed just 48 hours ago, the exact same day they announced their trip at the dinner table, was a single, massive charge. $6,500. Merchant, Royal Caribbean Cruises, VIP upgrades and excursions. They hadn't just booked a trip. They had used my name, my credit, my emergency medical lifeline, to upgrade themselves to luxury suites, buy premium drink packages, and book island excursions. They took the money I might literally need to save my vision, and they bought champagne on the ocean. They maxed it out, I whispered. My voice didn't even sound like my own. It sounded hollow, like an echo from a ghost. Say that again? Beatrice asked. $6,500, I said, the words falling out of my mouth like stones. Royal Caribbean. They used my emergency medical card to pay for their VIP cruise. Silence fell over the line. Even Aunt Beatrice, who expected the worst from my mother, was stunned into speechlessness. In that silence, something inside me broke. It wasn't a fragile, tragic break like glass shattering. It was the loud, violent snap of a heavy iron chain. The chain of guilt, obligation, and desperate hope that had kept me tied to them for 32 years. All the sadness evaporated. The desire to cry vanished, replaced by an icy, absolute clarity. The gray fog in my vision didn't matter anymore, because my mind had never seen things so perfectly sharp. They weren't just terrible parents. They were thieves. They were parasites who were perfectly willing to drain my lifeblood while leaving me blind in the dark. Harper, Beatrice finally spoke, her voice deadly serious. You need to call the bank. Tonight. I am going to do more than that, I said, sitting up straight. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely. I felt a terrifying, euphoric sense of calm wash over me. I am going to burn their little kingdom to the ground. I hung up the phone. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess. I picked it right back up and dialed the 24-hour fraud hotline listed on the back of my primary debit card. A representative answered after a few rings. Thank you for calling fraud services. How can I help you tonight? Hello, I said, my voice steady and cold. I need to report stolen information and unauthorized fraudulent charges on my credit card. Someone has stolen my card details and charged $6,500 to a cruise line. The representative went through the security questions. I answered them flawlessly. Okay, ma'am, I see the charge here for Royal Caribbean, the agent said. Since you are reporting this as fraud, we will initiate an immediate chargeback protocol to the merchant. The funds will be clawed back from the cruise line, and your card will be permanently frozen and closed. Do you authorize this? I thought about my father's sneer. I thought about Stella rolling her eyes at my impending blindness. I thought about the new padlock on the cabin I bled for. Yes, I said, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face in the empty room. I want to freeze everything. Shut it down. Done. The chargeback is initiated, the agent confirmed. The merchant should receive the reversal notice within 48 hours. 48 hours. Right around the time my loving family would be standing at the port in Miami, trying to board their luxury ship. I hung up the phone. The ATM had just officially closed its doors. And tomorrow morning, I was going to make sure they could never, ever make a withdrawal again. Monday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that whipped through the city streets, but I did not feel the chill at all. I felt completely insulated by a terrifying, deeply focused sense of calm. I had not slept a single minute over the entire weekend. Instead, I had spent the past 48 hours sitting on the floor of my home office, surrounded by open file cabinets and stacks of paper. I was gathering every financial document, every account number, every insurance policy, and every legal paper that tied my existence to my mother, my father, and my sister. At exactly 9 in the morning, the second the heavy glass doors unlocked, I walked into the sleek, quiet office of my financial advisor, Carmen. Carmen had always been a quiet, highly observant woman. 3 years ago, when I first sat in this exact same chair and told her to set up a $500 monthly automatic transfer to my parents' checking account, she had gently questioned it. She had reminded me that I was young, single, and needed to prioritize my own retirement savings before subsidizing two fully capable adults. I had ignored her back then, blinded by my desperate need to be the good daughter. Well, my vision was failing now, but my mind had never been clearer. I was not going to ignore her advice ever again. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from her mahogany desk, pulled a single, neatly typed sheet of paper from my bag, and slid it across the polished wood. It was a comprehensive list of directives. I did not offer a warm greeting or small talk. I just told Carmen that I needed to immediately and permanently cancel the $500 automatic monthly transfer to my parents. I told her to stop the direct payments to the private Montessori school my niece and nephew attended. Finally, I told her to completely remove my mother as the secondary authorized user on my oldest checking account, a foolish holdover from when I was 19 years old and still away at college. Every single financial pipeline that flowed from my pocket to theirs was to be sealed shut. Carmen did not ask for a detailed explanation. She did not offer unsolicited pity. She just looked at my face, saw the absolute, cold deadness in my expression, and started typing furiously on her keyboard. Within 15 minutes, the financial umbilical cord that had drained me for a decade was severed. From Carmen's office, I drove straight across town to the financial district to see my lawyer, Fiona. Fiona was a shark in a tailored pantsuit, the kind of woman who drafted contracts that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. I had hired her 3 years ago to draft my living will and set up my life insurance policy. Because I was single and had no children of my own, I had named my parents as the primary beneficiaries of my $500,000 life insurance policy, with my sister Stella listed as the secondary backup. My apartment, my savings, my investments, everything I had worked for was legally set up to go directly into their pockets if something tragic ever happened to me. I sat in Fiona's office, listening to the faint hum of the city traffic outside her window, and told her I was revoking every single piece of paper we had ever signed. I wanted a brand new will drafted immediately. I instructed her to name Aunt Beatrice as my sole beneficiary and the executor of my entire estate. Furthermore, I needed her to draft an immediate, legally binding revocation of the medical power of attorney I had granted my mother years ago. I was about to go into a major surgery, and I was absolutely not going to let a woman who had just stolen my emergency credit card make decisions about my life support or medical care. Fiona took copious notes, her silver pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. When we finished, she neatly stacked the papers, folded her hands together on the desk, and looked at me right over the rim of her designer glasses. She told me that these were massive, sweeping changes to my estate, and that I was completely disinheriting my entire immediate family. She reminded me of my legal rights but asked, for the official record, if I was absolutely sure about this decision. I looked at her. I thought about the shiny new padlock on the lake cabin door. I thought about the $6,500 charge for luxury cruise upgrades. I looked Fiona dead in the eye and told her that they had locked the door to my cabin to punish me for going blind, so I was permanently locking the door to my vault. I was absolutely, undeniably sure. The morning of my surgery arrived with a cruel irony. The gray fog in my eyes had thickened so severely over the last few days that I could barely make out the faces of the nurses preparing me in the pre-op room. Everything was a muted, blurry watercolor of pale blues and harsh whites. The fear that I had been successfully pushing down for weeks, masking it with anger and logistical planning, finally bubbled up to the surface. It is a profound, deeply primal terror to willingly surrender your sight, even temporarily, and trust a stranger holding a laser to give it back to you. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs I thought the monitors would short out. Aunt Beatrice was right there beside me. She had picked me up at dawn, driven me to the hospital, and sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair by my bed, holding my hand right up until the anesthesiologist injected the heavy sedative into my intravenous line. The last thing I saw before the chemical darkness pulled me under was the bright, blinding glare of the surgical lights overhead, a harsh white circle that slowly collapsed into absolutely nothing. When I finally woke up, the entire world was gone. There was no light. There were no shapes. There were only thick, heavy-pressure bandages wrapped tightly and securely around my entire head, covering both of my eyes completely. The sensory deprivation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The darkness was absolute, thick, and suffocating. I panicked for a brief, terrifying moment. I tried to sit up, my heart monitor suddenly beeping at a frantic, erratic pace until I felt a familiar, warm hand grasp mine firmly. Aunt Beatrice's voice cut through the dark void. She told me she was right there, that I was safe in the recovery room, and that the doctor had come out to say the corneal transplant was a complete success. I had done perfectly, and now all I had to do was rest. I let out a long, ragged breath, feeling the tension slowly drain out of my muscles. I was temporarily blind, heavily medicated, and my face throbbed with a deep, dull ache, but I was not alone. By late afternoon, Beatrice had driven me back to my apartment and carefully helped me settle into my own bed. Being plunged into total, inescapable darkness forces your other senses into massive overdrive to compensate. The lingering smell of the hospital antiseptic on my skin and clothes was suddenly overpowering. The feeling of the soft cotton sheets against my legs felt magnified and strange. But the most prominent, unavoidable thing in the room was the sound. Specifically, the sound of my cell phone. I had handed my phone over to Beatrice before the surgery, strictly instructing her to put it on silent, but to keep a close eye on the notifications. Even buried under a pillow on the nightstand, I could hear the device vibrating against the solid wood. It was a continuous, angry, highly rhythmic buzzing. It sounded exactly like a furious wasp trapped inside a glass jar, desperate and aggressive. I turned my bandaged head toward the sound, my throat feeling dry and raspy from the breathing tube they had used during the operation. I asked Beatrice if that was them calling. I heard Beatrice shift in the chair next to my bed. She let out a deep, weary sigh, the kind of sigh that comes from dealing with exhausting people. She told me that the phone had not stopped vibrating for 3 straight hours. Victor, Diane, Stella. They were calling back to back, relentlessly. She told me I had 24 missed calls and 11 new voicemails. I leaned my head back against the pillows. The darkness around me suddenly felt significantly less like a suffocating cage and much more like a secure, impenetrable fortress. The timing was absolutely impeccable. It was Thursday afternoon. My loving, entitled family was supposed to be standing at the port of Miami right now, boarding a massive, multi-story luxury cruise ship to sail off into the Caribbean sunset. A slow, grim smile formed on my face beneath the heavy layers of gauze. I told Beatrice to turn the volume up and play the voicemails. She hesitated, warning me that I had just come out of a major surgery and needed to keep my blood pressure down to avoid complications. But I insisted. I told her that hearing those messages was the absolute best medication I could possibly receive right now. Aunt Beatrice tapped the screen of my phone, and the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom was instantly filled with the shrill, panicked sound of my mother's voice. The first voicemail was frantic, but Diane was clearly trying her best to maintain that fake, overly polite tone she always used when she was in public and didn't want strangers to know she was losing her mind. Over the awful audio connection, I could clearly hear the chaotic background noise of the cruise terminal, the rolling of heavy suitcases, the loud intercom announcements, and the chatter of thousands of excited vacationers. Diane's voice trembled as she ordered me to pick up the phone right that second. She said they were standing at the priority boarding desk in Miami, and there was some ridiculous, embarrassing error with my credit card. The ticketing agent was telling them that the massive charge for the VIP suite upgrades had been officially flagged for fraud and completely reversed. They could not get their room keys. She demanded that I call the bank immediately, clear up the misunderstanding, and fix the issue because they were holding up a massive line of important people. Beatrice tapped the screen to skip to the next message. It had been left exactly 10 minutes later. This time, it was my father. The polite, public-facing tone was completely gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered rage. Victor's voice boomed through the speaker, so loud it made me flinch in my bed. He demanded to know what the hell was going on. He yelled that the Royal Caribbean floor manager had been called over and told them straight to their faces that the actual cardholder had reported the VIP upgrade transaction as stolen information. He asked if I had completely lost my mind. He ordered me to call the fraud department back, authorize the $6,500 charge right this second, and stop embarrassing the family in front of hundreds of strangers. I lay perfectly still in the dark, my mind effortlessly painting a beautiful, vivid picture of the scene. I imagined Victor, dressed in his expensive, ridiculous vacation linen shirt, his face turning an angry shade of purple as he sweated under the brutal Miami humidity. I imagined Diane, clutching her oversized designer sun hat, the color draining from her face as she realized the golden ticket she had so cleverly stolen was rapidly turning into worthless ashes. And I imagined Stella, standing there with her two massive, overstuffed suitcases, slowly coming to the horrific realization that she was not getting onto that floating buffet. The third voicemail was from Stella, and she had abandoned all dignity. She was full on, hysterically crying. She called me a vindictive brat. She sobbed into the phone, asking how I could possibly do this to them after everything she had been through lately. She wailed that security personnel were actually asking them to step out of the boarding area and move to the side. She demanded that I fix it right now, screaming that I owed her this vacation. The voicemails progressed beautifully over the next few hours, tracking their emotional descent from arrogant demands to blinding rage and, finally, to absolute, rock-bottom panic. Victor left a message threatening to formally disown me. Diane left a weeping voicemail trying to gaslight and guilt-trip me, claiming that my father's heart condition could not take this level of stress and that if he had a heart attack in the terminal, it would be my fault. Stella sent a barrage of text messages, which Beatrice read aloud to me in a flat, monotone voice, calling me every vicious, unspeakable name in the dictionary. The reality of their situation was glorious. They had flown all the way to Florida, stood proudly in the VIP boarding line, handed over their passports, and were publicly, humiliatingly denied entry. Because they had absolutely no emergency savings of their own, they could not simply produce another credit card to cover the $6,500 deficit. The cruise line, acting swiftly on my fraud report, had clawed the money back. My family was stranded at a humid port, surrounded by luggage, watching their dream vacation literally sail away across the ocean without them. And then came the final voicemail, left just an hour ago. The tone had shifted entirely. It was Victor again, but he sounded completely defeated, his voice small and desperate. He begged me to pick up. He confessed that they'd been forced to book a cheap, dirty motel near the airport because they did not have enough cash for return flights until the next morning. Then, his voice cracked as he revealed that Stella's kids' private school had just emailed them, stating that the tuition check had bounced. He asked, his voice trembling, if I had actually cut everything off. He pleaded with me to call them back so we could talk. I smiled underneath the bandages and asked Beatrice to turn the phone completely off. For the first time in 32 years, I felt absolutely zero guilt. 3 agonizing days later, the doctor finally allowed me to remove the heavy, suffocating pressure bandages. I was still incredibly far from being fully healed. My vision was no longer a gray fog, but it was incredibly blurry, like looking at the world underwater. The ambient light in my apartment hurt my eyes intensely, feeling like sharp needles against my corneas, so I had to wear thick, wrap-around dark sunglasses even with all the blinds drawn closed. But I could see the outlines of furniture. I could see the colors of the walls. I was no longer blind. Aunt Beatrice had just stepped out to go to the local pharmacy to pick up my next required round of expensive antibiotic eye drops. I was sitting quietly on my living room couch, sipping a warm cup of coffee, when the pounding suddenly started. It was not a polite, neighborly knock. It was a violent, highly aggressive hammering against the solid wood of my front door. It rattled the hinges and echoed loudly through the quiet apartment. I did not need to check a peephole. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side. I stood up slowly, tying my thick cotton bathrobe much tighter around my waist. I walked toward the entryway, my heart pounding a steady, heavy, rhythmic beat against my ribs. Surprisingly, I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt a cold, hard, unshakable resolve settling deep into my bones. I reached out, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, grabbed the handle, and pulled the door wide open. Victor, Diane, and Stella were crowded together on my front porch. They looked absolutely terrible. They were visibly exhausted, heavily sunburnt from their miserable time stranded in Florida, and they looked completely unhinged. Stella's hair was a tangled, greasy mess, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Diane was clutching her expensive leather purse tightly against her chest like it was a weapon. Victor stepped forward the second the door opened, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of purple with raw rage. He raised his hand, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my face, looking like he was half a second away from physically striking me. He spat the words at me, his voice shaking with absolute fury. He called me an ungrateful piece of trash. He screamed that I had completely ruined them, that I had humiliated the family name, stranded them in a terrible motel in Florida, and intentionally canceled his grandchildren's school payments just to be vicious. He demanded to know who the hell I thought I was. He took a large, threatening step forward, clearly trying to intimidate me, trying to use his physical size and decades of parental authority to push me backward into the house. I did not move a single, solitary inch. I stood my ground on the threshold, my massive dark sunglasses completely hiding my healing, bloodshot eyes, staring right back at his red, sweating face. I kept my voice dangerously low and perfectly steady, slicing through his screaming. I told him that I was the person whose credit card he had just stolen. Diane shrieked from behind his shoulder, her voice shrill and desperate. She yelled that it was a family emergency card, that they were blood relatives, and that they had every legal and moral right to use it however they saw fit. I dropped the title of Mom entirely. I looked right at her and stated that a luxury Caribbean cruise was not a medical emergency. I told her that she had taken $6,500 without permission. She had committed felony credit card fraud and stolen from her own daughter, while that daughter was preparing to go into an operating room to save herself from going blind. She actually flinched, stepping back as if my words had physically struck her. Stella pushed past our mother, stepping up right next to Victor. She screamed that I was a pathological liar, that I was just doing this for the sick attention, and accused me of literally starving her kids by cutting off their essential school tuition. I reached deep into the deep pocket of my bathrobe, pulled out a thick, heavy envelope folded in half, and threw it as hard as I could directly at Stella's chest. It hit her, bounced off, and the printed papers scattered wildly across the concrete porch. It was the detailed bank statements. My $84,000 spreadsheet. My voice finally rose, letting a decade of suppressed anger explode into the open air. I told Stella that I had paid her way through life for 10 years. I reminded her that I bought her cars, paid her rent, funded her children's education, and completely rebuilt the mountain cabin that they had just proudly locked me out of. I told all three of them that I was not a daughter, a sister, or a family member to them. I was just a bank. And as of this week, the bank was permanently, irrevocably closed. Victor glared at me, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He demanded that I reverse the fraud claim immediately and reinstate the monthly cash transfers, threatening that if I refused, I would never step foot in their house again and would be dead to the family. I let out a harsh, dry, genuinely amused laugh that echoed loudly down the quiet suburban street. I told him that they had already killed me the day they demanded I cancel my surgery for a vacation. I lowered my voice to a terrifying, absolute whisper. I promised them that if they ever came to my property again, if they ever called my phone, or if they ever tried to contact my employer, I would not just leave the fraud claim as it was. I would march down to the precinct, file a formal police report for identity theft and grand larceny, hand every single document over to the district attorney, and happily watch my parents go to federal prison in their golden years. They completely froze. The absolute, chilling conviction in my voice paralyzed all three of them. They were used to a scapegoat who backed down, who cried, who apologized to keep the peace. They did not recognize the woman standing in front of them in the bathrobe and sunglasses. I pointed at the street and commanded them to get off my property before I called the police for criminal trespassing. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Then, Victor slowly lowered his pointing hand. All the arrogant bluster drained out of him, replaced by the sudden, sickening realization that he had permanently lost all his power over me. He turned around and walked heavily toward his car without saying another word. Diane burst into loud, dramatic, theatrical tears and rushed after him. Stella stood there for a few seconds, staring blankly at the bank statements fluttering on the ground, before turning and jogging away. I closed the heavy door, locked the deadbolt, and leaned my back against the solid wood. I was physically shaking from the adrenaline, but underneath the dark glasses, I was smiling. The immediate fallout from that confrontation on my porch was entirely predictable, deeply pathetic, and, ultimately, highly entertaining to watch unfold from a distance. Over the next few weeks, as my eyes slowly continued to heal in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my apartment, my mother Diane launched a massive, coordinated smear campaign on Facebook. She posted incredibly long, rambling paragraphs about suffering a mother's broken heart, writing dramatic poetry about children who cruelly abandon their aging parents in their greatest time of financial need. She desperately tried to paint herself as a selfless martyr who had sacrificed everything and was just trying to keep her fractured family together against a toxic, ungrateful daughter. But Diane had severely underestimated the situation. While I was recovering in the dark, Aunt Beatrice had been incredibly busy. Beatrice had systematically called every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend in our extended network. She did not yell, she did not cry, and she did not exaggerate. She just calmly and methodically laid out the absolute facts. She told them all about my failing corneas and the impending blindness. She told them about my parents changing the locks on the cabin I had paid for. And, most importantly, she told them about the stolen credit card used to illegally upgrade a luxury vacation. So, when Diane's highly dramatic, tear-stained posts finally went live, the army of flying monkeys she fully expected to rally and attack me never actually materialized. Instead, her posts were met with a deafening, humiliating silence from the entire extended family. A few bolder cousins even left sarcastic comments, innocently asking how the VIP cruise to Miami was, or inquiring if she needed help paying her legal fees for credit card fraud. Unable to handle the public humiliation and the lack of sympathy, Diane ended up deleting her entire Facebook account within 48 hours. Stella's reality check was significantly harsher and much more grounded in reality. Without my endless, reliable stream of funding to prop her up, her carefully curated, lazy lifestyle completely collapsed practically overnight. Because the tuition checks bounced, she was forced to pull Toby and Mia out of the highly expensive private Montessori school and enroll them in the local, underfunded public school system. For the first time in over a decade, she actually had to go out, apply for jobs, and start working retail just to keep her financed car from being repossessed by the bank. The golden child was finally, brutally, being forced to live and survive in the real world like an actual adult. Despite the deep satisfaction of seeing karma and justice finally served, there was still a lingering, heavy sadness in my heart. It was absolutely not for my parents, and it certainly was not for my sister. It was for Toby and Mia. Those two little kids were innocent casualties in a miserable, toxic war that they did not understand and did not ask to be a part of. About a full month after the explosive confrontation on my porch, Aunt Beatrice came over to my apartment for our newly established weekly lunch tradition. She walked into the kitchen, dropped her purse on the counter, and handed me a crinkled, slightly dirty white envelope. She rolled her eyes and explained that she had accidentally bumped into Stella at the local grocery store. Stella had childishly tried to ignore her and walk the other way, but 7-year-old Toby had run over. He had quickly snuck the envelope into Beatrice's purse and whispered a secret request for her to give it to me. I sat at the kitchen island and opened the envelope very carefully, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a piece of standard, folded construction paper. It was a drawing done in heavy, waxy crayon. It showed 2 stick figures standing next to a very lopsided green tree. One figure was small, and the other was much taller, wearing massive, exaggerated black sunglasses. Written in shaky, uneven, second-grade handwriting at the very top of the page was a short message. It said he missed me, he was sorry his mom and grandma were so mad all the time, and he was really glad that my eyes didn't hurt anymore and I could see again. He signed it with a clumsy heart. I sat at the counter and finally broke down. I cried. It was the very first time I had truly, deeply cried since this entire horrible nightmare began weeks ago. I cried for the pure, untainted innocence of a little boy who just missed his aunt, a child completely and totally oblivious to the toxic greed and entitlement that had so deeply infected his mother and his grandparents. I took that crayon drawing, smoothed out the wrinkles, and pinned it proudly to the center of my refrigerator. The very next morning, I picked up the phone and called Carmen, my financial advisor. I instructed her to take $20,000, the exact same amount of money I had foolishly wasted on fixing up that stupid mountain cabin, and divide it. I had her create 2 ironclad, legally bulletproof trust funds, one for Toby and one for Mia. The funds were strictly locked down. They could not be accessed, touched, borrowed against, or even viewed by Stella, Victor, or Diane under any circumstances. The money would automatically release to the kids when they turned 18 years old, specifically designated to help with college tuition or a down payment on a first home. I was completely and utterly done with my family, but I refused to let their financial incompetence and greed completely destroy the future of the next generation. I planted a small seed of hope for those 2 kids, locked it away safely out of their parents' reach, and finally walked away clean. 6 months later, I stood quietly in front of the tall, full-length mirror in my bedroom and took a long, incredibly deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs completely. I was no longer wearing the thick, heavy, unflattering prescription glasses. I was no longer hiding behind the dark, wraparound protective sunglasses that made me look like I was constantly avoiding the paparazzi. My corneas had healed beautifully and perfectly. The terrifying, creeping gray fog that had threatened to permanently steal my world was completely, 100% gone. The everyday colors of my room, the warm, rich amber of the hardwood floor, the crisp, clean white of the freshly washed bedsheets, the vibrant, living green of my potted plants by the window, were incredibly sharp, brilliant, and breathtakingly beautiful. I walked over to the bed, zipped up my large, heavy canvas travel backpack, and threw the strap comfortably over my shoulder. Today was a very important day. For the first 32 years of my life, I had desperately poured every single ounce of my energy, my hard-earned money, and my conditional love into a massive, unfillable black hole. I had willingly sacrificed my own vacations, my peace of mind, my financial security, and very nearly my literal eyesight, all just to keep people warm who would have happily watched me freeze to death if it meant they could save a few dollars. But today, the narrative was finally changing. Today, I was taking a 2-week vacation. I was absolutely not driving up to a locked cabin in the cold mountains, and I was certainly not boarding a ridiculous luxury Caribbean cruise ship with ungrateful relatives. I was flying to Europe. Completely solo. I had planned 14 glorious days of wandering aimlessly through massive art museums in Paris, eating incredible amounts of authentic pasta in Rome, and simply staring at the gorgeous historical architecture in Barcelona. And the absolute best part of the entire trip was the fact that I was paying for every single flight, hotel, and meal with the money I had effortlessly saved over the last 6 months simply by refusing to be my family's personal, zero-interest ATM machine. I walked out of my apartment, securely locked the door behind me, walked down the stairs, and stepped out onto the sidewalk into the bright, warm morning sunlight. The crisp city air felt physically lighter in my lungs. I felt lighter. People on the internet often ask how you manage to survive cutting off your own flesh and blood. They ask if the overwhelming guilt eventually eats you alive, or if you regret losing the people who raised you. I won't lie and say it is a perfectly easy process. There are always going to be unexpected, quiet moments when you are walking past a park and you see a large family laughing together at a picnic table, and a sharp, phantom ache twinges deep in your chest for the loving, supportive family you always desperately wished you had. But the cold, hard truth of the matter is that the family I was mourning never actually existed in the first place. It was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion, a performance that I had been paying a very high monthly subscription fee to keep running. When Victor and Diane spitefully changed the locks on the lake cabin, they genuinely thought they were punishing me. They thought they were aggressively locking me out in the cold, teaching me a harsh lesson, and forcing me to realize just how much I needed their approval and their presence in my life. But they were completely, fundamentally wrong. That shiny new silver padlock on the wooden door did not lock me out. It locked them in. It firmly locked them inside a miserable, shrinking prison of their own unbelievable entitlement, their own endless greed, and their own toxic, exhausting dysfunction. And as I had stood on that freezing porch months ago, staring down at a brass key that no longer fit the mechanism, the heavy, invisible iron chain around my neck simply snapped and fell away. In their desperate attempt to punish me, they had actually handed me the greatest gift of my life. They set me free. I adjusted the heavy strap of my backpack, walked toward the yellow taxi waiting for me at the curb, and felt the wonderful warmth of the sun directly on my face. My eyes were completely open. My vision was 20/20. And for the very first time in my entire life, I could finally see exactly